Good, you're good, you're good. We're good. Step right, step back forward.
The swamp of government corruption by imposing a 5-year ban on lobbying by executive branch officials.
The question exploded across Florida that morning like a shockwave. What happens when the person sworn to stop the cartels becomes their most valuable asset? At 7:42 a.m., corridors that once echoed with routine footsteps erupted with the heavy stride of federal agents. Sunlight cut through the blinds of the sheriff's office, catching dust in the air, dust later identified as fentanyl. A badge hung on the wall, polished, proud, symbolic. Seconds later, that symbol shattered. Sheriff Daniel R. Calderon stood frozen as black-vested FBI agents moved in with precision. No warning, no negotiation, no escape. The cuffs locked, cold, final, and behind that moment lay a story darker than Florida had ever imagined. Inside Calderon's office, where citizens filed complaints, where families sought protection, agents pulled open hidden compartments built into cabinets and walls, vacuum-sealed bricks, fentanyl, methamphetamine, rubber-banded stacks of cash. According to federal investigators, the discovery was not an isolated stash. It was evidence of a 2-year infiltration of his department by Mexico's most violent cartels. Reuters reporting from similar corruption cases has noted that cartel infiltration of U.S. law enforcement is methodical, patient, and financially overwhelming, a warning now materializing in Florida. The event triggered a deeper examination. Financial records uncovered by prosecutors revealed structured payments from cartel intermediaries between $600,000 and $700,000 flowing directly to the sheriff. The Guardian and BBC have documented how organized crime networks often disguise bribery as consulting fees, cleaning services, or operational reimbursements. Calderon followed the same blueprint. His wife's cleaning company, no clients, no invoices, no payroll, quietly funneled tens of thousands each month. This was no side deal, this was a business model. Key developments emerged quickly. Calderon allegedly coordinated safe passages, rerouted patrol units, falsified emergencies, and provided privileged intelligence to Sinaloa and CJNG linked operatives. According to federal filings, marked patrol vehicles were repurposed as escort units rather than enforcement tools. Evidence vans once reserved for seized contraband were used to transport it. DW and Defense News have repeatedly warned that when law enforcement becomes operationally compromised, criminal networks shift from reactive tactics to strategic expansion using uniforms as camouflage, not deterrence. The strategic implications were immediate and severe. Under President Donald Trump's 2025 administration, federal security agencies have elevated domestic corruption to a national security threat. Analysts from Jane's Defense Weekly argue that cartel infiltration of U.S. institutions weakens deterrence, disrupts border integrity, and undermines the credibility of federal operations abroad. When a sheriff collapses, the damage does not remain local. It reverberates across alliances, intelligence sharing frameworks, and America's international standing. Beyond the geopolitics lies the human impact. Families in Calderon's district trusted the badge. Parents believed the sheriff's office protected their children, yet the narcotics stored inside his walls, enough to poison thousands, ended up in schools, hospitals, and neighborhoods. Overdoses rose. Trust eroded. A uniform meant to reassure now represented betrayal. So the question remains, if a single badge can open the door to a cartel, how many more doors across America stand unlocked? If this story matters, stay with it, because the deeper the investigation goes, the darker the truth becomes. Dawn had barely settled over Florida when investigators realized Sheriff Calderon's arrest was not the climax, it was the opening chapter of a far wider betrayal. Federal analysts tracing his digital footprint discovered that corruption was not an accident or a moment of weakness. It was architecture, designed, layered, protected, the kind of system Reuters has described in recent reports as institutional rot engineered from within. The event that unfolded next exposed that design. Inside Calderon's financial records, prosecutors identified a pattern: structured deposits, mirrored withdrawals, frequent cash movements just below federal reporting thresholds. His wife, Emily Calderon, was quietly listed as the sole owner of a cleaning service that had never cleaned anything. No invoices, no employees, no equipment, yet tens of thousands flowed through monthly. According to forensic accountants consulted by BBC and Al Jazeera, this is classic laundering legitimizing cartel payments by simulating routine business revenue. Key developments expanded the scope even further. This was not a lone sheriff gone rogue. 14 current or former officers, including police chiefs and state troopers, were implicated in an interconnected bribery scheme. Their roles varied. Some redirected patrols, others cleared transport lanes, others falsified reports or looked the other way when special vehicles passed through rural intersections. A former deputy admitted he routinely managed evidence storage, removing confiscated narcotics and returning them to cartel couriers. The Guardian recently highlighted similar cases where law enforcement infrastructure became a shadow pipeline. Calderon's operation matched that pattern with frightening precision. Strategic analysis painted an even starker picture. Under President Trump's 2025 anti-corruption directive, DHS and FBI classified cartel infiltration as a hybrid national security threat. Jane's Defense Weekly notes that cartels no longer function solely as criminal syndicates. They behave like paramilitary organizations, deploying intelligence, logistics, financing, and psychological operations to weaken institutions. Calderon became a node in that network, a point of access, a doorway. Defense news analysts further warned that compromised officers create blind spots in state operations, allowing transnational groups to bypass detection systems that cost billions to build. The corruption wasn't passive, it was operational. Marked patrol cars, symbols of authority, were used to escort contraband. Officers faked emergencies on radio channels to clear highways before cartel convoys approached. A county sheriff's SUV that once patrolled neighborhoods quietly transported cash and narcotics between safe locations. Federal investigators also documented that some deputies received counterfeit IDs and forged permits, part of a batch totaling 19,000 fake documents uncovered during the probe. These were not favors, these were assignments. The human impact deepened the tragedy. In the communities Calderon swore to protect, residents had long complained of rising overdoses, missing evidence, and inexplicable disappearances of confiscated drugs. Families trusted officers who in reality had already crossed a line that can never be uncrossed. For parents, the betrayal was intimate. For children, it was invisible. For neighborhoods, it was catastrophic. Now a new question haunts the state. If a cartel can turn a sheriff's office into an operational hub, how many more institutions are one bribe away from collapse? If the balance between security and freedom is breaking, who restores it? By sunrise, Florida was already bracing for impact. What began as a single sheriff's arrest had detonated into the largest coordinated federal operation the state had seen in more than a decade. The question loomed over every agency involved: what kind of criminal empire requires a statewide takedown to dismantle? The answer surfaced within hours. One built on casinos, warehouses, firearms, stockpiles, and cartel logistics hidden in plain sight. The event unfolded with military-like choreography. At 5:55 a.m. in Ocala, a convoy of unmarked federal vehicles rolled into position. Agents from FBI, DHS, and ICE advanced silently toward what locals believed was an internet cafe, but the neon fish tables and flashing slot screens were merely a facade. The moment the breach command was issued, steel doors buckled under battering rams. Dealers froze. Money counters stopped mid-count. A suspect sprinted toward a back exit, only to be intercepted by a K9 in a blur of fur and force. The entire building fell under federal control in 90 seconds. Key developments spread across Florida like synchronized shockwaves. Just 3 minutes away, Lake County agents stormed a warehouse that served as a distribution hub. Boxes of slot machines, cash bundles totaling $280,000, and coded ledgers filled with initials and dates were seized. According to investigators, these were not gambling records. They were operational logs tracking payment cycles, safe locations, and transit schedules. Al Jazeera has reported similar techniques used by cartel cells worldwide, where gambling fronts act as cash laundromats for narcotics revenue. But the most explosive find came in Kissimmee. A small office complex, plain walls, cheap carpet, a forgotten address concealed what FBI analysts later called a regional command node. Inside, agents discovered 324 firearms, including modified rifles, ghost guns, and tactical shotguns. Next to them, sealed containers held 2.3 tons of narcotics, enough, as public health experts told Reuters, to devastate entire counties. Taped beneath a desk drawer lay a handwritten list of county sheriffs labeled safe, unsafe, hours, a map of influence, a blueprint of infiltration. Strategic analysis from BBC and Jane's Defense Weekly reinforced the significance this was not a local operation, it was supply chain architecture. Cartels had built a horizontal structure across Florida casinos, collecting cash warehouses, distributing contraband, corrupt officers, protecting routes, shell companies, laundering revenue. In the 2025 geopolitical climate under President Trump, federal security doctrine frames such networks as hybrid warfare criminal infiltration that destabilizes institutions, erodes public trust, and undermines national resilience. The human impact began surfacing immediately. Courtrooms overflowed as 126 individuals tied to the operation were arrested. Some were business owners, some were public employees, some wore badges. When residents watched officers led away in handcuffs, the collapse of trust was palpable. What families once believed were places of safety, police stations, sheriff's offices, community centers, had secretly become passages through which poison entered their communities. And now the most unsettling question rises: if Florida's criminal empire operated undetected for years, how many more networks across America remain invisible, shielded by uniforms and official titles? If this matters, stay with the investigation. The worst revelations are still ahead. The deeper investigators pushed into Florida's criminal network, the more unmistakable the pattern became. This empire did not end in the state. It expanded outward west toward the very gateways of the nation, and that led to the most alarming question yet. What happens when the cartels no longer sneak across the border? Because the border itself is opening the door. The event that followed shocked even veteran federal agents. At the El Paso Port of Entry, prosecutors uncovered that CBP officer Manuel Perez Jr. had quietly transformed his inspection lane into a passageway for cartel operations. No gunfights, no high-speed chases, just a nod, a hand signal. A vehicle waved through without inspection. Cars loaded with migrants, hidden compartments, and narcotics flowed past him as if invisible. Reuters reporting confirms that corruption at ports of entry often operates exactly this way. Low visibility, high impact, with enormous quantities slipping through undetected. Key developments didn't stop in Texas. In California, CBP officers Jesse Clark Garcia and Diego Bono elevated corruption to a disturbing level of sophistication. BBC and DW have both documented similar cartel communication tactics in Europe and Latin America, short untraceable visually coded messages that bypass detection algorithms. The officers' signal system allowed more than 100 pounds of narcotics across the border, methamphetamine, fentanyl, and mixed loads destined for American neighborhoods. Cartel money funded their Gucci shopping trips, luxury resorts, and even racehorses. As one federal official noted, they bought paradise with poison. Then came the most devastating breach. At San Isidro, the busiest border crossing in the United States, CBP officer Leonard Darnell George allegedly accepted more than $400,000 in bribes. No coded messages, no secrecy. He acted openly, waving drug-packed vehicles through as though operating a VIP lane. The Guardian reports that similar corruption cases at major crossings have historically taken years to uncover due to the sheer volume of daily traffic. Here, the breach was blatant. After a swift guilty verdict, George received 23 years in federal prison, a sentence meant not just to punish, but to warn. Strategic analysis became unavoidable. Under President Trump's 2025 border security doctrine, DHS and military analysts describe cartel infiltration of CBP as a national vulnerability on par with cyber intrusions. Jane's Defense Weekly emphasizes that when frontline officers are compromised, enforcement systems collapse from the inside. Every cleared vehicle becomes a strategic failure. Every corrupt officer becomes a force multiplier for transnational criminal networks. Defense News adds that corruption at the border undermines America's credibility in international security cooperation. Partners cannot rely on U.S. intelligence if domestic gateways are compromised. The human impact is already visible. Communities thousands of miles from the border feel the consequences. Emergency rooms overwhelmed by fentanyl overdoses. Schools implementing new drug protocols. Families watching loved ones slip into addiction fueled by narcotics that pass through lanes meant to protect them. Hospitals told Reuters that a single corrupted port of entry can alter the trend line of overdoses in an entire state. And so the nation faces a chilling question: if the border, the first line of defense, can be bought for the price of a luxury vacation or a stack of envelopes, what protections remain uncorrupted? The story continues, and the stakes only rise from here. By the time federal agents laid all seized evidence on the table, cash logs, burner phones, casino ledgers, forged IDs, and corrupted border records, the scale of the infiltration could no longer be dismissed as scattered misconduct. It formed a single coherent picture, and that picture forced a sobering question into the center of Washington's 2025 security agenda under President Donald Trump. How do you defend a nation when the breach comes from within its own institutions? The event that followed marked a turning point. Federal prosecutors initiated a sweeping racketeering case, one that read less like a local indictment and more like a blueprint of an international criminal enterprise. What emerged from the filings echoed patterns highlighted by Reuters and The Guardian in recent reports on transnational crime cartels no longer push their networks into U.S. territory. They weave themselves into its institutions. Court records documented over $600,000 in cash bribes, nearly $1 million in seized assets, and a sophisticated network of fronts, including internet cafes and shell businesses used to launder millions. Key developments stretched beyond Florida and into the broader federal map. Agents traced 19,000 counterfeit IDs, 800 forged permits, and $42 million laundered through legitimate seeming operations over 3 years. DHS specialists comparing this case to similar European corruption rings told BBC that infiltration functions like a virus. It spreads until it becomes the system. In this case, evidence vans transported drugs. Instead of storing them, patrol cars escorted smuggling convoys, and border lanes were cleared not by oversight, but by bribery. Every safeguard had a price. Every weakness was exploited. Strategic analysis placed this corruption squarely in the category of hybrid warfare. Jane's Defense Weekly has warned that cartels operate with military-grade intelligence and logistical strategies, adapting, infiltrating, and recruiting with precision. Under President Trump's expanded anti-corruption directive, the Justice Department classified the Florida border link as a critical national security breach, echoing defense news assessments that cartel networks now rival hostile state capabilities in their ability to exploit systemic vulnerabilities. The corruption didn't merely enable smuggling, it weakened the integrity of America's law enforcement structure, and asset adversaries around the world monitored closely. And then came the confessions. Suspects once loyal to the network financial operators, deputies, CBP officers began turning on each other. Krishna, one of the cartel's key financial intermediaries, provided investigators with ledgers detailing payment cycles, safe houses, and internal codes. Border officers fearing life sentences cooperated, revealing how recruitment occurred. Lunch breaks, favors, envelopes slipped into car visors, then full-fledged involvement. DW's reporting on similar cases in Latin America notes that corruption rarely begins as a conspiracy, it begins with a compromise. The human impact deepened as the case unfolded. Hospitals reported overdose clusters tied directly to narcotics funneled through the corrupted ports. Schools updated emergency protocols. Neighborhood associations demanded answers from leaders who themselves felt blindsided. Families across multiple states realized that the drugs killing their loved ones had traveled through a government lane, waved open by a uniformed officer. And now, the nation confronts a question that extends far beyond one sheriff, one state, or one border crossing. If cartels can infiltrate institutions from local offices to federal gateways, what other systems stand at risk, and what will it take to rebuild the trust that has been shattered? The final chapter approaches, and it carries the heaviest weight. As courtrooms filled and federal indictments multiplied, one truth settled over the nation like a shadow. The collapse of Sheriff Calderon's empire was not just a law enforcement scandal. It was a warning, a signal flare illuminating the deepest fear in any democracy that the very people trusted to protect the public might become the ones who opened the gates to its enemies. And so the final question emerged stark and unavoidable. What is the true cost when a badge becomes a weapon instead of a shield? The event that closed this investigation was not a dramatic raid or a firearm seizure. It was something quieter and far more devastating. Federal analysts mapped every compromised checkpoint, every manipulated patrol route, every falsified report. When the reconstruction was complete, the pattern became undeniable. Calderon's network stretched from rural sheriff's offices to the busiest ports of entry in the United States. A system hollowed from within, a chain of trust shattered link by link. Key developments revealed staggering losses. The narcotics trafficked through these corrupted channels totaled more than 2.3 tons of volume that public health experts told Reuters could alter overdose statistics for entire states. Financial crimes investigators linked millions in laundered revenue to shell companies operating as casinos, cleaning businesses, and freight services. The Guardian reported that the cumulative societal cost of fentanyl-driven addiction hospitalizations, emergency responses, long-term treatment reaches into the billions annually. But the most severe cost wasn't financial, it was psychological. When residents watched officers escorted away in cuffs, something fundamental changed. Confidence in institutions, faith in oversight, the belief that uniforms protected rather than endangered. For families who had reported crimes to the sheriff's office, the betrayal felt intimate. For children who saw police as heroes, it felt disillusioning. DW has documented similar psychological fallout in communities worldwide. After major corruption scandals, fear replaces trust, cynicism replaces cooperation, and community police partnerships fracture sometimes for generations. Strategic analysis pushed this into a global context. Under President Trump's 2025 security framework, the White House emphasized that domestic corruption is now a frontline national security threat, not a local matter. Jane's Defense Weekly warned that cartel infiltration mirrors tactics used by foreign intelligence services, slow, calculated, and aimed at eroding state capacity from inside. Defense News added that America's international prestige depends on the integrity of its law enforcement system. Allies rely on shared intelligence. Partners rely on interdiction reliability. If a sheriff can be bought, if a CBP officer can be swayed by emojis or envelopes of cash, then adversaries abroad take notice and exploit the signal of weakness. Yet the human impact remains the deepest wound. Families grieving overdoses sourced from drugs waved through by corrupted officials. Neighborhoods wondering which institutions remain safe. Officers who upheld their oath now working double to repair the damage of those who broke it. Communities learning that corruption does not begin with violence. It begins with silence. And now the nation is left with a haunting question. If this infiltration went unnoticed for years, how many more networks hide behind uniforms, titles, and the illusion of authority? The fight to restore trust begins here. And it depends on those willing to confront the truth, expose the rot, and demand accountability. If you believe stories like this must be brought into the light, stay engaged, stay aware, and never look away, because corruption thrives in darkness, but it cannot survive exposure. What if the most dangerous cartel in America never crossed the border, and because a sheriff opened the door for them? At 7:42 a.m., the FBI stormed a Florida sheriff's office expecting a corrupt cop. Instead, they uncovered something far darker, a hidden command center for Sinaloa and CJNG packed with bricks of fentanyl cartel cash and coded ledgers buried behind certificates on the wall. Moments later, agents found 324 firearms, 2.3 tons of narcotics, and a handwritten list labeling county sheriffs as safe, unsafe hours. This wasn't just corruption. This was infiltration, calculated, disciplined, and visible. And as the investigation spread from Florida to the US-Mexico border, one truth became undeniable. Cartels weren't sneaking past America's defenses. They were being waved through by the very officers sworn to stop